Chapter 190. The Fount of Light, 2. News quickly spread through the Paladins and the Inquisitors that Eugene Lionheart had crossed through the warp gate and violated the temple's barrier. The first 3 Inquisitors to confront him had been overpowered in an instant, while the 3 Paladins had stood helplessly as Eugene passed them. With things turning out this way, Giovanni, the captain of the Blood Cross Knights, could no longer leave things up in the air. The presence of the Blood Cross Knights in the temple wasn't permitted by the Knight Commander, but Giovanni believed the ritual to be sacred and holy and felt tremendous joy at being able to abet the ritual as a knight serving God. Giovanni wasn't alone in the desire to stay true to his faith. All the Paladins who accompanied Giovanni considered it an honor and joy to have the opportunity to participate in the sacrament. So why did it matter that they were here without orders from the commander? This was the work of God, and nothing was more important for the devotees of light. Even if the intruder was the hero chosen by the Holy Sword, his will to cause destruction could not precede God's will. Indeed, it was an unacceptable act of rampage for Eugene Lionheart to have invaded the temple without consent, then hurt the Inquisitors. He needed to be stopped even if the hero was injured in the process. The hero, the incarnation of light, could never ruin the sacrament of light. Bodily wounds could be healed over time, but sin was irreversible, especially if it involved denying God's will and insulting the sacrament. It was an even greater transgression if the sinner was the hero, who was supposed to be nobler than anyone else and obedient to the will of light. He must be stopped. Giovanni's earnest, desperate desire was well conveyed to the Paladins. They sympathized with Giovanni's wish while sharing his pain. They had to stop the intruder even if he was the hero. No, he needed to be stopped because he was the hero. The ceremony could never be defiled by the hero. Atterix was of the same mind as Giovanni. From the beginning he had believed in meeting the intruder with full force. He never should have been allowed to set foot inside the barrier. His regret drove him to give orders to the Inquisitors. They could not afford to hold back. They had to forget the fact that they were up against the hero. The Paladins and Inquisitors could move unhindered through the haze that enveloped the temple. Their eyes were not misled by the fog, which meant that their search should have been a breeze, but they were experiencing difficulties. They could not find Eugene anywhere, though he must have entered the barrier. Hundreds of Paladins and Inquisitors searched the ruins and surrounding forests thoroughly, but none of them managed to catch even a whiff of Eugene's scent. Eugene had disappeared like a ghost after entering the barrier. Where the hell did you go? How? The groups were naturally divided once orders came down. The Paladins stuck with their colleagues as did the Inquisitors. In the first place, they belonged to different organizations, so they weren't accustomed to working together. A squad of 10 Paladins was searching the outskirts of the temple, a place bordering the barrier. For anyone to gain immunity to the deception of the barrier, they needed to be blessed by Cardinal Rogerus. Without the blessing, it was impossible to approach the temple, let alone the spring. No matter how long anyone ventured in the fog, they would continue to circle the outskirts. For this reason, many Paladins were deployed to the outskirts. Unfortunately for the devotees, Eugene was well aware of this fact as well. The Paladins felt something. They were on high alert and they could feel something slowly creeping up on them. And then they saw it. The thing encroaching on them was. Their faces stiffened. Their lips fluttered in prayer and they inched closer to each other. Paladins did not wear armor. The only exception was when the Pope, the agent of light, gave orders to prepare for a holy war. But this ritual wasn't war. It was a sacred event of light, so what need was there to wear their armor? At least that was the idea, but unfortunately they desperately needed their armor now. All 10 Paladins felt as such when faced with the fierce, sinister energy that slowly paralyzed their senses. Their prayers gave rise to a stronger light, and the light wrapped around the bodies of the Paladins in the form of armor. It was a skill available to all Paladins of Eurus, armor of light. This armament of faith would change in shape and size according to the depth of the user's faith, and the Paladins of the Blood Cross Knights could even summon armor capable of defending against sword force. They could block even stronger attacks in magic if they built a shield of light. It could be said that the Paladins of Eurus were characterized by the strong, unshakable defense they boasted. 10 light-clad Paladins donned their helmets in unison. They raised their shields and drew swords, and the light twisted around the blades to transform their weapons into long spears. They hid behind their proud shields and connected them in a long line. The spears jutted out of the gaps, and a wall of light was completed in an instant. They had trained for confrontations against large monsters, demonic beasts, and enemies with similar levels of threat. But what they faced now was neither a monster nor a demonic beast. Did that mean he wasn't their enemy? They weren't sure. The paladins were desperate. They wanted to deny that the young man they faced was the enemy. Was it perhaps because he was recognized by the Holy Sword? Maybe because he was the first hero in 300 years? No, that wasn't it. If they designated him as the enemy, they had no choice but to fight him. But they didn't want to fight. No, they could not fight. They had trained their will to be unwavering, but now, it was like a burning candle, fragile and easily shaken. The paladins were afraid of facing this young man, Eugene Lionheart. Eugene observed the paladins from a distance. He was coming from the source of the fount of light. He had contemplated destroying it and following it to wherever it led, but it was difficult to discern exactly where the complex mess of pipes led. He also had to think about the consequences of destroying the source, since it would affect the fount. It wasn't yet time. Thus he left the source behind and after taking a mere few steps, found himself in this place. He tried to make sense of it from a wizard's perspective. This barrier divided space into different zones and connected them in complex, contorted ways. The source of the fount would have been the heart, the most secretive location within the barrier, an impossible place to enter unless the damn miracle guided you. "Are you going to stop me?" asked Eugene while glancing at the holy sword in his hand. The divine weapon was emitting a subtle glow, and Eugene glared at it with a contorted expression. The paladins did not answer. They could not. They couldn't think of an answer to the obvious question. A fierce battle was taking place in their minds. "I don't want to stop him. Just open the way and let him through." "No, let's just run away." But they could not. Their lips were chapped, cold sweat drenched their foreheads and spines, and their hearts were pounding like mad. Fear forced silence on the paladins, but in their silence they quietly put their spears forward. They shifted closer to each other and tightened the wall of shields. The paladins were overcoming the sinister fear with their faith in God. Eugene could feel it as well. The paladins were gradually loosening up. The tighter their shields wove together, the more intense their light became. Finally, the quivering tips of their spears stabilized with faith. Such a sight ignited an explosion in Eugene's heart, and he felt his ash hair stand on end. He had told them to move, but they seemed set on blocking his path. Didn't that mean there was only one thing left for him to do? The flickering tongues of the white flame formula surrounded his body, and he took a step forward. A step was all it took. The gluttonous hands of the flame quickly engulfed the entirety of Eugene's self. Shatter. The light fractured into countless pieces. The flames surrounding Eugene burst forward and greedily devoured the debris of light. Taking a long breath, Eugene continued moving ahead. The paladin's wall of shields could not stop Eugene. The wall of light, bound by faith, was shredded by the raging flame as if it were nothing more than a sheet of paper. The spears they raised in determination were crushed even before they could be thrust. Their armor of faith only served to barely save their lives as they were crushed and smashed to an unrecognizable form. This was the work of the Holy Sword. Eugene's flames fluttered bigger than the light emitted by the blade, and he used the white flame formula to condense the sword force into a coat surrounding the blade of the Holy Sword. In truth, he did not need to use the Holy Sword. The beautiful ceremonial blade was, in fact, not practical at all as a weapon. Eugene already knew this. Nevertheless, he swung the Holy Sword because he wanted to. The Holy Sword Altair was an artifact left behind by that old dog god of light, and they believed in their god unconditionally. So he wanted to destroy their light with the Holy Sword. "It's hot," Eugene thought. His heart was racing even though he had not used ignition. The blood raged its course through his body far faster than normal, and his mana was stoking the fire instead of cooling it down. Heavy fog arose from nothingness. The ancient barrier recognized the enemy threatening the temple, and all the believers within the temple were alerted of Eugene's presence. All but the three conducting the ceremony at the fount began to move toward Eugene. Eugene wasn't aware of this, but even knowing would have changed nothing. He had no intention of backing down. If anything blocked his way, he would destroy it. If they fell and still attempted to stop him, he would trample them. If they held his ankles, he would cut off their hands. Each of his steps caused the fog to tremble despite the lack of wind. But the laughter, screams, groans and cries of the girls resonated as clear as a bell from a distance. What exactly was so omnipotent and omniscient about this light and whatever god? The flame surrounding the holy sword swelled as something leaped at him from beyond the fog. Eugene swung without looking and the pale light of the sword parted the mist. The flame followed shortly after, ripping through the fog with an even stronger light. Screams passed him by, but it was none of Eugene's business. It didn't matter how many he had cut down with his strike. He could feel hostility radiating from all sides. Their anger overpowered their fear and amplified their hostility into murderous intent. The hero was denying the sacrament of light. He was attacking the believers, those he was supposed to protect and lead. Most importantly, neither hesitation nor mercy could be found in his strikes. Not just that, he was striking down believers with the holy sword. It was truly unimaginable and sacrilegious. The devout paladins wept, and the inquisitors, the punishers of pagans, bled from their chewed lips. They charged Eugene without hesitation. The fog continued to pulsate. But since it was too thick, Eugene couldn't clearly distinguish his opponents. However, he could smell the blood from beyond the white haze. He could hear their chants and sobs. "Why are you the ones crying?" he called out. Eugene had many cards up his sleeve. He had Akasha from Siena, and he had the Lionheart's treasures: Storm Sword Wed, Thunderbolt Pernoa, Dragon Spear Carbos and Devouring Sword Asphalt. He had the Moonlight Sword. However, he did not want to use anything else. Here and now he would only use the holy sword. He would deny their very essence with the sword left by the god they cried and sobbed for. Eugene's flames continued to blaze. He continued forward with a fierce, sinister expression. The sword whipped with every pulse of the fog, then came the screams and blood. Some dodged the sword and rushed in, but they only delayed their deaths by a second. It looked almost as if he were swinging without thought, but no one was able to approach him. No one could come hastily without preparing themselves to be cut. Even if they prepared themselves and approached with caution, they would be cut. Impatience seemed to push them forward, but they were greeted with gut-wrenching blows. The formation of the paladins was forced to change due to the continued blows. A thoughtless approach only served to reduce their numbers. Nevertheless, the paladins could not let Eugene continue down his path. Dozens of paladins recited the same prayer, and the armor of light protecting their bodies shattered before wrapping around their entire formation. Whoosh! The gigantic wings of light drove away the fog as they spread in their full glory. Eugene stared straight at them, noticing the accumulation of power united by the prayers of dozens of paladins. Faith gathered with prayers and swelled endlessly. Even though the sun was gone and the sky dark, the light emitting from the paladins descended like an artificial sun. The large wings of light soared high into the sky, and the prayer of the paladins intensified accordingly. Their heightened chants resonated like a hymn. After rising high enough to pierce heaven, the wings came crashing down. Countless feathers of light poured down toward Eugene like a meteor shower. Eugene glared at the sight as he raised his sword. Crack! An intangible force started pressing down on Eugene. The inquisitors had gathered their prayers during the paladins' chant in unison. The force that suppressed Eugene was different from the typical use of magic, but he couldn't feel the unique characteristics of divine magic from it either. It was likely ancient magic, something similar to blood magic. Hundreds of years ago, the Holy Empire had spearheaded the magic hunt, and the inquisitors of Malficarum were now monopolizing the very magic they had previously labeled as heresy. Eugene could feel the suppressing force growing stronger by the second, and it wasn't simply binding him physically. The bond interfered with the flow of mana inside his body and neutralized him completely. Huh, Eugene scoffed before willing his core to spin. The ring flame formula caused his production of mana to increase explosively. Agarotha's ring reacted to Eugene's explosive mana from his left ring finger. The ring was a relic left by an ancient, perished war god. Although Agarotha's will no longer lingered in the ring, it was imbued with a spirit resembling its former master's temperament. Agarotha's ring reminisced about the battlefields of the myths as feathers poured down from the heavens. The ring knew the duty it needed to perform at times like these. Rumbly. Agarotha's ring caressed the mana Eugene poured out, and the divine power contained within the ring strengthened the mana further. Lightning flame became intertwined with the flow of mana. The torrent of mana surging from Eugene caused the Inquisitors to lose control. Although it would be difficult to find anything superior when it came to binding spells, and dozens of Inquisitors were combining their powers to hold Eugene in place, the best they could do was to restrict him for a short moment. The moment their bind was broken, the feathers were already in contact with Eugene's body. However, the feathers failed to hurt Eugene. Instead, the flames surged upwards, burning away the feathers in their rampage. Eugene raised the holy sword amid the chaos. Something strange blended with the mana he controlled using the ring flame formula. It was different from the lightning flame. Eugene felt it to be foreign and strange, but it wasn't impossible to control either. The divine power contained in Agarotha's ring combined with Eugene's mana rather than flowing separately. The white flame formula of the lion heart. Empty sword of the Dragonic. Lightning swirled around the flames covering the holy sword, and lightning pulled mana from the atmosphere back into the flames. The empty sword caused the flame of the blade to swell, then shrink. The empty sword condensed the unstable mana by binding it, then coated the blade in a repetitive process. Rumbly. The materialization of the paladin's chants transformed from wings of light into a large sword. It was clear that the second form of their gospel could easily sweep away its enemies as well as anyone in the vicinity. As such, the Inquisitors retreated to the side of the paladins, then joined in the prayer to provide support with their divine power. The sword of judgment exuded an even more brilliant light, and Eugene tightened his grip on the holy sword while looking up. Agarotha's ring radiated a bleak glow. Crack, crack. Sharper tongues of lightning permeated the flame. Twice refined by the empty sword, the white and blue flames of the blade spread as black spots. The sword of judgment started its descent toward Eugene, and the flame engulfed the light. Chapter 191. The Fount of Light 3. Mare tried her best to wrap herself within the folds of the cloak and block all the sounds coming from the outside. The world was falling apart outside and she did not want to hear it. Screams and sobbing filled the air, all sounds that Mare did not want to hear. The aura and emotions radiating from Eugene made her feel uneasy, so she also squeezed her eyes shut. She knew that she could not try to calm Eugene down. His anger felt more than justified at the moment. He's not using magic, Mare thought. If Eugene used magic, it would give way for Mare to intervene. If Eugene chose to rampage with magic, Mare would happily take on a supporting role. She could calculate the trajectory of his attacks and make them more precise and merciless, slicing through hearts and heads without mercy. If Eugene's mana was about to be depleted, Mare would willingly forego her own form and provide him with mana. But he's looking after me, Mare realized. The knowledge only made Mare feel more distressed. He chose not to use magic at all, knowing that it would cause her to intervene. As such, Mare huddled in the deep darkness within the cloak, doing nothing. She only hoped that the storm outside would pass sooner rather than later. Ugh! Himoria sat up with a groan, her body shaking. She could not understand what had happened. She had arrived a bit late since she had been too far from the location of the battle. On the way to the battle with her subordinates, she had seen the light coming from the Gospel of Punishing Evil. The Gospel of Punishing Evil was a sacred formation of the Blood Cross Knights created to oppose count-ranked demons and give paladins the power to fight such demons head-on. Had they truly deployed even the Gospel of Punishing Evil to suppress one young man, Eugene Lionheart? Her question lingered as she continued running, but then she saw the wings of light being consumed by flames. She saw a dark blue flame collide with the Sword of Judgment, and that was the last she remembered. Where did my memories go? Himoria thought to herself as she removed the mask from her mouth. She had just been caught in the midst of a fierce storm, and now her memories were scattered. She groaned as she felt a warm, sticky liquid oozing out of her mouth. It wasn't as if she had been hit directly, but the aftermath of the storm had nonetheless caused damage to some of her organs. Himoria took deep breaths and surveyed her surroundings. None of the other Inquisitors remained standing. In fact, some of them were nowhere to be seen. Himoria wrapped her disheveled coat around herself as confusion washed over her. She took a few steps forward before coming to a stop. What lay in front of her was incomprehensible. This had clearly been flat land, or so her memory told her, yet there was no ground in sight. It was as if a deep pit had been there for ages. Below, Himoria saw the bodies of more than 100 knights and inquisitors lying in a tangled mess. It was a gruesome scene. Some of the corpses were no longer recognizable as human, and even those barely clinging to life looked seriously injured. Himoria could not believe what she was seeing was real. The Knights of Blood Cross were considered one of the greatest knightly orders on the continent. The knights belonging to the order were known across Eurus to be both skilled and devout in their faith. Maleficarum. These inquisitors had dedicated themselves to the religion of light for hundreds of years. In the past they had fought against demons and wicked wizards, and in the current age they hunted down traitorous heretics and apostates. The two groups were known as the dual pillars of power in Eurus. Even if there weren't any high-ranking figures among them right now, for more than 100 paladins and inquisitors to fail to stop a single man. Was this really happening? Himoria was at a loss for words. She just closed her mouth, feeling the taste of blood inside, and held her breath. She could feel the tips of her fingers quivering, and the gloves couldn't hide the shaking. She clenched her fists to try and suppress it in a futile effort. She did not want to avoid his gaze, but she was afraid to look him in the face. She could feel her crimson eyes slowly, ever so slowly, descending. She heard the approaching footsteps. Eugene Lionheart was climbing up from the pit below. He was holding the holy sword, which flickered with flames, and slowly walked up the steep slope. His expression was blank. Clearly he felt absolutely nothing about what he had done. Himoria could not do anything. She just stood there watching as Eugene approached. The distance between them was slowly diminishing. Himoria's gaze kept drifting down toward the deep pit where the disheveled paladins lay. Several inquisitor corpses could also be seen nearby, their red cloaks, a symbol of Maleficarum, soaked in blood. Himoria's lips slightly parted as a realization hit her. This couldn't be happening. Had the hero just killed a devotee? But Himoria didn't think that was the problem. She forced her head up and looked at Eugene. Those eyes. Himoria could not believe Eugene was the hero. The holy sword in his hand was not radiating its usual divine light. It was just producing a wild bunch of flickering flames. Eugene had no faith. Those eyes did not feel like the eyes of the incarnation of light. But Himoria knew exactly what those eyes were. They were the eyes of a heretic who rejected the light. The eyes of an apostate who denied and hated the light. The eyes of a fallen one who had plummeted to the pits of hell. At that moment, Himoria's faith overcame her primal instincts. She conquered her fear and stood up. Her lips parted and red symbols immediately appeared on both of her cheeks. Himoria was known as the Guillotine. She had gained this moniker 4 years ago when she was just a 17-year-old girl. The Holy Empire had been ruled by a religious government for a long time, and the people knew very well how easy and convenient it was to control those who were overly zealous. Therefore, the Holy Empire was constantly giving birth to new religions. Of course, all of them derived from the religion of light, with only slight modifications to the doctrine. The preachers of these newly born religions would whisper sweet words that catered to the convenience of believers and gradually take away the followers of the light. Such had been the case 4 years ago. A new religion had come to light, with a wizard of the upper circles sitting as the head of the church. The wizard would boast about his magic as being a miracle from God, and under this head of the church were rather suspicious figures, including wizards, mercenaries, and knights involved in crime. At that time, the number of apostates who were fooled had been in the hundreds. However, the new religion had disappeared from the world in just one night, all because of a young girl who had been brought in by the Punisher Atarax. She had directly hacked off the heads of all those belonging to the cult. That was how Himoria had earned her reputation as the Guillotine. The symbols on her cheeks started spreading, covering her skin all the way to her ears, and Himoria felt the heat on her face as she parted her lips. Her eyes were no longer wavering as she glared at Eugene. She was a proud inquisitor, a punisher of apostates and heretics. In her eyes, Eugene was no different from a demon. No, in fact, he was simply a demon right now. There was no possible way that the hero's eyes could harbor such hatred and hostility. The hero could not possibly deny the light. Eugene paid no attention to Himoria. She had not even caught his eyes. He planned to cut her down if she blocked his way and to let her leave if she fled. Something felt strange, however. Eugene's instinct had been honed through hundreds of battles that put him on the verge of death, and that sharp instinct was currently warning him to move. He obeyed. Himoria opened her mouth and tore into the air, and simultaneously Eugene moved. Not knowing exactly what he was pitted against, he only took a few steps to the side. Thump. Part of the flames wrapped around Eugene's body disappeared. Though difficult to explain, it was clear what had happened. Himoria had actually cut through space from afar. Her sight, Eugene thought, immediately seeing through her power. Was she capable of causing a tear in the space where her sight was aimed? In that respect, it resembled the demon eye of darkness that Iris used, but, to be truthful, there was no comparison in terms of power. Eugene had battled against Iris in his previous life and also just a few months ago. But even if he had not possessed such experience, it wasn't difficult for Eugene to fight while taking notice of where the opponent was aiming. He straightened his posture and stared at Himoria. Ah. Himoria started to speak. Stop. She slowly articulated the words, one syllable at a time. It wasn't just plain speech but rather a command containing magical power, similar to the draconic language. The mana in the air resonated with her command and rushed toward Eugene. Although her power wasn't as mighty and elaborate as draconic, it used a rush of mana to force a simple command on her opponent. A thick, dense cloud of mana surrounded Eugene, causing him to stop in his tracks exactly as Himoria commanded, and she immediately followed up with another attack. He came to a new realm of understanding. The strange power she used with her words could be activated instantaneously, but it wasn't as powerful as proper magic. If the opponent possessed outstanding abilities, they could simply shake it off with force. Himoria took another bite out of the space around him, but Eugene escaped his bindings and suddenly accelerated. He shook off the mana restraining him and rushed toward Himoria. Himoria was astonished, but her reaction was immediate. Fall. Mana pressed down on him from above, but Eugene's ring flame formula reacted with an even stronger counterforce. Ring. Mana spiraled around his body, attempting to tear him to pieces. However, a single step was sufficient to dissipate the mana. Die. Mana gathered around his throat like a noose, but there was no need for him to even attempt to shake it off. The holy sword was already on its trajectory toward Himoria. Himoria shouted once more, but she was not given a chance to even utter the full word. The holy sword removed her legs in one fell swoop, and before she had even fallen to the ground, the sword moved once more and cleaved her arms off as well. Himoria's limbless torso fell to the ground, and she screamed due to the unbearable pain. However, her pitiful state did not prevent her from glaring at Eugene with contempt. The tattoos on her cheeks squirmed and she repeatedly parted her lips, but none of her commands were effective. Moreover, she had lost her fists before she could ever swing at him, and she had lost her legs without having a chance to move. Ah! She screamed while biting at the air, but it was a pointless struggle. Eugene jumped up, glanced at her with apathetic eyes, then kicked her in the stomach. Crack! Himoria couldn't do much to resist without any of her limbs, and unfortunately, it had not been a simple kick either. As soon as Eugene's foot made contact, his mana penetrated her body and crushed all her innards. Himoria's body rolled deep into the pit and Eugene stared down for a moment. He could see some who were still desperately holding on to life and thought to himself, should I bury them all? He entertained the thought for a moment but did not act on it. Instead, he actually hoped that some of them would narrowly escape death. He wanted them to survive and harbor doubt against their unblemished faith. He wanted the doubts in their hearts to continue growing. He wanted those doubts to make their beliefs rot away. He wanted them to spread their doubts about the existence of God to others. Eugene turned around and moved forward. The dense fog and barrier had vanished, swept away by the storm of flames that he had caused earlier. Thanks to that, he could now clearly see the temple in the distance. He did not encounter any obstacles until he reached the temple. Most of the paladins and inquisitors were lying dead or dying in the pit, and the others, like the inquisitors who had been accompanying Himoria, had been swept away by the aftermath of the Sword of Judgment. The temple looked extremely old, at least 300 years old. No, it had definitely existed for much longer than that. Eugene remembered the girls from before Anise, the saintess from 400 years ago, the fount, and the devices that should not have existed, the ones responsible for filling the fount. What had happened here? What was a saintess? And how was Anise's holy grail connected to the jawbone of the 400-year-old saintess? Eugene could barely make a connection in his mind, but he did not want to piece it together. More importantly, he could not infer the answer to the fundamental question. Why did they have to go so far? And what about Christina? Sir Eugene. He stopped. Passing through the path laid out by the pillars, he arrived at the center of the temple. Instead of the altar that would have been there normally, he saw a large pool emitting a faint light. The fount of light. Christina lay sleeping with her eyes closed in the center of the pool as if she were praying. The calm pool of water seemed to wrap around her body like a warm blanket. The fount, the golden pool, shimmered and shone brightly, befitting its name. It made it look even more abominable. Christina was bleeding while submerged in the pool. Yet, despite shedding so much blood, her expression was incredibly peaceful. Her face overlapped with the face of the little girl who cried out from the pain. Her face overlapped with the smile that he had constantly seen since they had met at the Plaza of the Sun, the saintly smile that she adorned like a mask. Her face overlapped with the smile she unconsciously had on the train when they were exchanging stories. Christina had told him that she had been in the pool several times since she was young. When he had asked if she just soaked in the spring normally, she had only replied after a few breaths. She had been wearing a mask to hide her emotions. Exactly how many times had she worn that mask until now? Sir Eugene. Now he understood what Christina had been afraid of. She was obsessed with being the saintess. She had spoken about the bond between the saintess and the hero and how she would willingly give her life for the hero. It was an abnormal way of thinking, something that could easily be mistaken as the path of black magic. Eugene knew very well that Christina would have never wanted him, the hero, to see her like this. Christina knew that Eugene only had a very vague sense of heroism and absolutely no faith in the god of light. Her knowledge would have only made her more averse to being seen like this. This was why she had tried to avoid bringing Eugene to Trescia. In fact, she had even prepared an excuse. However, it would have been fine if she had simply told him not to come. If they had not met at the square or taken the train together, Eugene would not have come to Trescia. In his ignorance, he would have done nothing and simply waited for Christina to return. However, Christina had made a different choice. Although she had been afraid of revealing anything about herself, the saintess, the fount, and the way that she had been raised since young as a saintess candidate by Cardinal Rogerus, she had still boarded the train with Eugene. She had shown her mask, her discomfort, and her fear. If you don't want to go, you don't have to. You know that, right? Eugene regretted asking the question at that time. He had asked the wrong question. No, rather, he should never even have asked the question. The only thing I should be feeling at this moment is a little pressure. I've never once thought I didn't want to do this. He had seen right through her lie. Nevertheless, he had left it alone, thinking that he was respecting Christina's determination. Wrong. Showing such consideration did not suit Eugene. What was warranted from him on that day on the train was not a question. Don't go, it was what he had been supposed to say instead. Was it already too late? Oh, it wasn't. Eugene continued to approach the fount. Saintess, hero, such things did not concern Eugene in the slightest. Even if Christina wasn't the saintess, he would willingly form a relationship with her as long as she wanted to. Instead of the abominable bond formed from blood, he would bond with her as human as two comrades. If there was a hero in this world, he certainly wouldn't hesitate to do what is just and right. If Christina wanted the hero Eugene, then he was willing to be a hero at this moment. Sir Eugene, called out Sergio Rogerus one last time. He let out a long sigh and released his hands from prayer. Do not come any closer. I can overlook this matter if you stop right now. Sergio continued. Sir Eugene, you've committed too many sins. Even if you are the hero chosen by the light, it is the greatest possible blasphemy to invade a ceremony directly supervised by God. Sir Eugene, you killed those whom you were supposed to lead. You defiled this sacred ritual with blood and dirt on your feet. Sergio clenched his fists. Giovanni, who was shedding tears of blood at the death of his subordinates, also stood up. Aderix looked back at Eugene with bloodshot eyes. Please return, for it might not be too late. There is a confession room in the cathedral, so please go back and wait there. I am willing to listen to your confession, Anne, said Sergio. Divine retribution, said Eugene. He raised the holy sword to the side, and flames of antipathy completely consumed his eyes. I will. All. His heart pounded as if it were going to burst. The hero is supposed to be the incarnation of light, right? Ominous, ferocious flames enveloped the holy sword. So I will slaughter you with this damned sword, according to the so-called will of light that you lawed like dogs. He didn't know if it really was the will of light for him to slaughter these lunatics, but until now the light of the holy sword had never suppressed Eugene's intention to kill, not in the slightest. The light failed to illuminate. Chapter 192, The Fount of Light 4. As soon as the words, divine retribution, escaped Eugene's mouth, the three people blocking his way could not hide the change in their expressions. It was only natural for righteous, faithful believers to feel enraged by Eugene's offensive words. Even if Eugene was the hero recognized by the holy sword, he was not permitted to say such blasphemous words. In Uras, the hero was officially recognized as the incarnation of light. However, even the incarnation was only an incarnation, not the light itself. Moreover, Eugene was not a believer of light and wasn't like the great Vermouth of 300 years ago. He had not saved countless people, nor had he brought forth numerous miracles. Therefore he needed strict and rigorous verification in order to be considered the true hero. Under these circumstances, although the three had no choice but to admit that Eugene could wield the holy sword, they could not sincerely acknowledge that he was the hero. And right now, Eugene had interrupted and obstructed the holy and sacred ritual and even slaughtered faithful servants of the light. To add insult to injury, he even dared to label his atrocious acts as divine retribution. How dare you? Giovanni's eyes were consumed with rage as he shouted at Eugene. He took steps forward while calling forth divine power. There was a good reason behind how he could stand as the captain among hundreds of knights belonging to the Blood Cross, and it was that he always pursued the light with devout, unwavering faith from an early age. He had made a decision to devote all that he had to serve the light. His noble faith materialized into a brilliant light, and an armor of bright light wrapped around him as he extended his arms to the sides. Whoosh! A giant hammer leaning against the wall jumped into Giovanni's hand. "Sir Eugene," Sergio called out with a cold gleam in his eyes. He shook his head while rolling up the wide sleeves of his habit. "You just said something that you should not have." Instead of answering, Eugene gave a crooked smile. Something he should not have said? It was ironic to hear such bold words from someone caught red-handed. No, he could not apply that logic to these people. They certainly understood the situation differently. They were absolutely convinced that their actions were righteous. These lunatics were fully convinced that their rituals were sacred and their side was in the right. It was clear that they could not understand how Eugene could be acting like this as the hero, but the same was true for Eugene. He could not understand them and had no intention of even attempting to digest their fanatical ideas. He did not care at all what their circumstances were. He could see Christina lying in the fountain, bleeding, and he recalled the countless images of the young girls projected to him by the draconic spell. He could almost see a niece in front of him, staring at him with an emotionless, doll-like face and lightless eyes. Eugene took a step forward, exhaling a deep breath filled with countless emotions. Giovanni reacted immediately and kicked off the ground as if he had been waiting for Eugene to make a move. Although the hammer he wielded was heavy, befitting its shape and size, it wasn't slow by any means. Before anyone could react, Giovanni's hammer was on a path toward Eugene at an incredible speed. Boom! The deafening clash threw Eugene backward at breakneck speed, and Giovanni felt convinced by the dull impact he felt in both his hands. Eugene had failed to dodge and he had failed to block. It was clear that he was exhausted from his journey here. The deaths of his subordinates had not been in vain. "You are!" Giovanni charged forward with a loud shout and chased after Eugene. Adorix and Sergio followed suit right behind Giovanni. They could only delay the ceremony for a short time. Since the wounds last engraved on the Saintus candidate were almost healed, they needed to chisel more wounds in order to allow the water to permeate. Eugene stared at the three with eyes filled with enmity. Although he had been blown back by Giovanni's hammer, he was completely uninjured. He had redirected the brunt of the blow in a fine manner unnoticeable to Giovanni, and he had intentionally allowed himself to be flung backward. It was all because he was worried about Christina. But Eugene regained his balance and stomped the ground, leaping even further back. Meanwhile, the three men were fiercely chasing him and were already near Eugene. That giant paladin, Eugene did not know who he was, but the aura he exuded was extraordinary. He was likely one of the captains in any case. As for Adorix's movements, they were naturally excellent. He was hiding his presence like an experienced assassin of Nahama, and he continuously looked for gaps in Eugene's defense. Sergio stood out even when compared to the two powerful warriors. It was only natural for his divine power to be outstanding, given that the man had received a stigmata and been appointed as the cardinal, but even his movements hinted that he was not an opponent to be taken lightly. Whoop! The hammer tore through the air, closing the distance to Eugene. However, Eugene did not follow the weapon's trajectory with his eyes. Instead, he calculated the distance he had opened between himself and his opponents. He came to a judgment: at this distance surely he could. His arm whipped the air, and the holy sword wriggled like a snake and soared up. Compared to Giovanni's hammer, the holy sword was thin and fragile, not unlike a skewer. However, such things were not important. The heights that knights and warriors pursued, Eugene found simply laughable. Having honed his skills and abilities in hundreds and thousands of fights, Eugene was able to parry Giovanni's attack all too easily. Giovanni's hammer was deflected upward, and blood spurted from the hand gripping it. Giovanni could feel that the hammer would have escaped his grasp had he lacked even a little bit of power, and he could not believe it. How could a sword swung from such an unstable position contain so much power and speed? Oh, holy light! As Giovanni recited a prayer in his head, the armor of light surrounding him transformed. Divine magic replenished his courage, and his wounds were healed immediately. The grace granted him strength and reinforced his body. Giovanni grabbed the hammer securely once more, bringing it down upon Eugene's head in a swift motion. However, Eugene had no intention of playing along with Giovanni's offensive. He leaned forward and took a giant step. Crack! An intense burst of light accompanied the lightning. It was only one step for Eugene, but Giovanni failed to see it as such. In fact, he had been unable to see anything at all. Before the hammer even touched the ground, Eugene had already passed Giovanni. As for the movement of Eugene's sword, that was even more so impossible for Giovanni to track. After all, he had failed to grasp Eugene's steps, so how could he see something even faster? The only evidence of Eugene's step was a lingering wobbly line of white fire. The thin string of fire made contact with Giovanni's armor of light, and with a cracking sound the light surrounding Giovanni was shredded apart. The armor of light, which boasted defense proportionate to the wearer's faith, was destroyed as if it was made of paper. Adarix raised his arms high while watching the scene unfold. Fwa! The skin covering his wrists ripped and crimson blood began pouring out. Blood magic. It was ancient magic that had been considered black magic and censored during the magic hunt of the Holy Empire. However, after gathering information about various types of magic during the hunt, the Holy Empire had performed a thorough analysis and granted the powers not judged to be actual black magic to the Inquisitors. Blood magic was specialized for combat. While regular magic invoked mana through the use of circles or cores and directed the mana through formulas, blood magic involved permeating formulas directly into the blood and using the blood as a medium to invoke magic. The blood pouring out of Adarix's wrists quickly pooled, and soon an enormous amount of blood soared up from around his feet. It was impossible to believe that so much blood had been spilled by a single person. The wave of blood poured over Eugene, but he did not panic. Instead, the flood of red only served to nourish Eugene's intense emotions. In response to Adarix's attack, Eugene's flames blazed with even more intensity around the holy sword. The wave was destroyed in an instant, resulting in a torrent of blood splashing on the ground. However, the droplets of blood still in the air aimed to take Eugene's life, each drop striking him with the power of a crossbow bolt. Meanwhile, Giovanni realized he was without his hammer and attempted to pull himself together. His hammer had been shattered to pieces by the holy sword, and Giovanni clasped his hands in front of his chest with intense anger. Giovanni's divine power acted to paint a giant cross on the floor, and Adarix immediately summoned his own divine power upon recognizing Giovanni's actions and scattered light through the air. Signum Crucis Barrier. Whoosh! The cross formed from the light in the sky and on earth shone brilliantly, and Eugene stood right in the midst of it. However, he was unimpressed. Oh! Oh! Giovanni exclaimed, trembling. The illuminating particles of light were permeating his body. Eugene was no stranger to this magic. Contrary to the expectations of his three opponents, Eugene was quite knowledgeable about divine magic. In fact, he was even more informed about divine magic compared to many high-rank priests. 300 years back he had fought for a long time alongside Anis. All kinds of knights had participated in the chaotic battlefields of the era, and the paladins of Eurus were among them as well. Signum Crucis Barrier was a barrier that strictly controlled the flow of mana within a designated space and temporarily amplified divine power, the power of priests. However, miracles that transcended reason were always accompanied by a corresponding price. Paladins who fought within the barrier paid a hefty price in exchange for gaining great power: their life. To the best of Eugene's knowledge, the only one who could perform such a miracle without much burden was Anis. The only price she paid was the deepening of the stigmata on her back and the blood that she had to spill in the process. Ha! Scoffed Eugene. The relic on his left ring finger was throbbing. Agarotha's divine power was reacting to the Signum Crucis barrier and resisting it. As a result, Eugene's flames were unwavering even though he was within the barrier, where the flow of mana was tightly restricted. Giovanni and Adarix came to a conclusion at this sight. The strange, otherworldly power that allowed Eugene's flames to remain untouched within the Signum Crucis barrier was different from the power granted to them by the god of light. It was the power of heretics. As an inquisitor, Adarix naturally perceived Eugene's power as belonging to a pagan faith. How could this be? Adarix jumped into the barrier without hesitation as tears of blood flowed from his eyes. Sir Giovanni, Eugene Lionheart is a heretic. He worships the pagan gods. Oh! Giovanni was also shedding tears of blood. How could a heretic be the master of the holy sword? The anger and despondency coursing through his body fueled and reinforced him within the Signum Crucis barrier. However, everything looked like nothing more than a rotten, third-rate skit to Eugene. Giovanni shouted, "Conviction!" The holy sword had returned to its scabbard in the meantime, and as Adarix shouted, "Punishment!" Eugene instantly unsheathed it and held it to the side. The two attacked him in unison. Although the two belonged to different organizations, they were united in their unwavering faith in the light. They were obligated to punish the terrible pagan who dared to deceive the light under the pretense of being the hero. Even if they were martyred in the process, they were willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of the light. Adarix rushed in as blood flowed freely from his arms, and Giovanni charged at Eugene after once more adorning himself in the armor of light. Meanwhile, Eugene's body appeared to tremble and shimmer. As all of this unfolded, Sergio watched from a few steps outside the barrier. As Eugene's figure started to shimmer, the holy sword was divided into dozens of copies. This was the white flame formula, the symbol of the Lionheart family. After being refined through a unique method, mana would be expressed as a white flame, then worn over one's entire body once fully mastered. It gave off an appearance similar to a mane of a lion, befitting the Lionheart name. Indeed, Eugene's appearance was precisely as expected. Petals of fire surrounded his body like the mane of a lion and he ran rampant. However, he did not exude the white, beautiful flames that they knew. Instead, after being condensed several times, the color of his mana was painted dark blue, like the color of the sky right before dawn. How? Sergio took off his hat with a moan. Could there be such a sinister light? Blood rained, but Adarix could not maintain his blood magic for a prolonged period. Moments later he found himself staggering backward. All of his blood had evaporated before he had a chance to use his magic, and his outstretched arms had been cut into dozens of thin slices. Moreover, the ink-blue flame had carved up his chest and stomach. Giovanni was in an even worse condition. He was no longer standing proud but rather scattered around, everything below the neck chopped into 4 distinct morsels. The head fell last, and the only thing that remained behind was the echo of his last word, conviction. How in the world? Adarix muttered, shuddering. He had been well aware that Eugene Lionheart was strong. He also knew that Eugene had been responsible for single-handedly suppressing the rebellion of the Black Lion Castle in just one night. He had seen Eugene toy with Himoria as if she were a child while he was still recuperating from his injuries and not in his peak condition. He knew that Eugene had survived an encounter with the Rakshasa princess and that Eugene had showcased incredible swordsmanship in the competition against the White Dragon Knights. However, this was beyond the realm of human understanding. It was simply absurd. There had to be a limit as to how strong someone could be. Moreover, it wasn't as if he had used magic. It wasn't as if he used other treasures of the Lionheart family. Instead he had armed the holy sword which was meant to be used only with and for the light, with an impure power and simply swung it. That was all. However, Adarix had failed to even see the strikes clearly. The same was true for Giovanni. The man had been struck down before he could even think to dodge or block the attacks. The trials and challenges they had experienced, the countless battles they had fought to become the captain of the Blood Cross Knights, to become a top inquisitor, all of it had been for nothing. None of it had meant anything in the face of Eugene's swordplay. He was on a different level, plain and simple. But how could this be? How could devout servants of the light be humiliated and teased by a corrupt man with an unknown pagan faith? The devil. Even if Eugene was on a different level, the two had clearly felt terrible hatred and killing intent from Eugene's strikes. The flames of the holy sword had evaporated Adarix's blood magic all too easily, and the blade had split his flesh and bones. The eeriness they felt stemmed from the murder and hatred unknown to the light that Adarix had served all his life. How could this be? Why was the holy sword not burning the hands of the pagan? The holy sword Altair was a treasure that had been lying dormant in the treasure vault of the Lionheart family since the time of the Great Vermouth 300 years ago. Since then, none of the heads of the Lionheart family had ever succeeded in drawing light from the holy sword. However, those bearing the Lionheart name were qualified to hold the holy sword, which was why the Holy Empire had failed to retrieve the blade from the Lionheart family for more than 300 years. Nobody had taken it because it was simply impossible for any priests of the light to even grasp the holy sword. But why? Adarix felt useless thoughts littering his head. He gasped for air while retreating. Why wasn't the holy sword burning the devil's hand? Why was the holy sword allowing itself to be used to slaughter the believers of light in the hands of a devil? Why? Adarix's pupils quivered as questions continued flooding his head. He recalled the many things he had done until now. For the light, for God, for the sake of being a more faithful servant, for the purpose of hunting heretics more efficiently and effectively, he had hunted apostates, heretics, and put an end to the study of ancient magic and black magic. He remembered the cultivation room in the basement of the Inquisitor's headquarters. Divine retribution? The words remained in his head, but he could no longer feel the same anger as before. Instead, Adarix felt immense fear. He feared that his entire existence and life were being denied. Had he been unfaithful? How? He had never missed a single service. He had bled for the sake of the light. Everything he had done was right. God had always looked after him and granted him the warmth of the sun. The sun always paved the way for a clear, blue sky in the capital Eurasia, and that itself was proof of God's existence and care. That should have been the case, but right now the sky was much too dark. Do not deny it. A voice brought him back to reality. Cardinal Sergio Rogerus no longer had a gentle expression. He walked into the barrier with unhesitating steps and cold eyes, his expression overlapping with his past self, the Inquisitor known as the Annihilator. The light will open the door to heaven to reward your martyrdom. Both you, Sir Giovanni, and all the believers who perished while resisting the devil. Everyone will be led to the place of light. Your Holiness, Adarix called out. The names of everyone here will be etched into the memorial in Uruz. You will be remembered as the saint who attempted to stop the devil until the very end, Sergio responded. Ah. So please, said Sergio, raising his hand. The stigmata on his exposed right arm was glowing softly. Adarix closed his eyes and rejoiced as divine heat started to spread from behind his back and throughout his entire body. Bang! His fall caused a storm of light, a huge explosion of divine power. The explosion was generated using Adarix as a conduit, and vaporized his body without a trace as it tore through the darkness toward Eugene. Eugene called upon the empty sword, and the holy sword once again swirled with flames. He stopped the storm of light in its tracks with a single powerful strike. Beyond the intense burst of light stood Sergio. He extended his arm toward Eugene under the backdrop of the brilliant light. The stigmata on Sergio's forearm was rather familiar. Although thinner and consisting of fewer characters, the stigmata on Sergio's right forearm was similar to the scar on Anissa's back. You guys, said Eugene. Sergio opened the palm of his right hand. The Signum Crucis barrier was amplified, and all the divine power scattered by the explosion was absorbed into his hand. Blood dripped down from his scar as it absorbed all the divine power. What are you? Asked Eugene. Instead of answering, Sergio wrapped his left arm in the red cloth draped over his shoulder. Then he curled his right hand into a fist and glared at Eugene. "You are the devil," said Sergio dryly. Eugene laughed silently upon hearing the remark.